Welcome to Brains and Machines. I am Giulia D'Angelo.
And I'm Sunny Bains.
In today's episode, Sunny is talking about using robots to validate cognitive mechanisms in animals with Barbara Webb, professor of biorobotics at the University of Edinburgh. After the interview, we will be talking to Rolf Etienne-Cummings from Johns Hopkins University about the issues raised.
Thanks, Giulia. Barbara started her career in psychology, but has become a pioneer in using physical robots to validate neural mechanisms discovered in insects, specifically crickets, ants, and bees. In this interview, we focus on her most distinctive contribution to the field, demonstrating that biological cognition can only be truly understood by building complete sensory motor loops that work in the real world. She does this through a combination of collaboration with biologists, analysis of which elements are critical to a physical model and which are not, and careful experimental design. There are links to her work and some of the specific papers we'll be discussing on our website. You can check them out at brainsandmachines.net. I met Barbara at her office in Edinburgh. Barbara Webb, welcome to Brains and Machines.
Thanks. I'm very happy to be here.
So can you start off by telling us a bit about your technical background? For instance, I understand that your first degree was psychology?
That's correct. Although when I studied psychology at the University of Sydney, it was actually a more general science degree where you start with 4 subjects, then 3, then 2, then 1. And alongside psychology, I studied computer science and mathematical statistics. Looking back retrospectively, I think I was trying to do an AI degree. At that time, it just wasn't an option that was available to me because I was always interested in cognitive science, in computational models, and in the more perception end of psychology, if you like. So then when I applied for a PhD position, that was the kind of thing that I wanted to follow through, was building computational models of perceptual systems.
And what was it that drew you to robotics as an experimental platform? Because as we're going to discuss, that was the thing that drew me to you back in the 90s.
So when I started my PhD degree at Edinburgh in artificial intelligence, as it was then, the fashion in artificial intelligence was that unless you built a robot system, you hadn't really built an intelligent system. And I think Rodney Brooks was very influential, certainly with my supervisor and the people I was talking to. It was basically, if you wanted to do AI, you needed to build a robot, particularly if you were interested in perception action systems. So I decided I had to build a robot model, not just a simulation.
So as I mentioned, you and I first met after I saw you speak about your work, demonstrating the neural mechanism that allows crickets to hear and move towards their mates. What was really interesting about this work was that you used a robot to perform the demonstration. So can you talk me through that work and the logic of what the robot was doing?
So having decided to build a robot, I knew I wasn't going to build a human robot. So I looked at insects as a simpler system where we might be able to build all the way from the sensory system through to the action with some understanding of the neural processes. And lots of people in neuroscience had been investigating what goes on in crickets. So this is basically a male cricket calling and a female cricket finds her way there. But there's a couple of very interesting things about how she manages to do sound localization, given her ears are very close together, and also how she recognizes the pattern, because it's critical for crickets to recognize the correct species pattern. So those were the problems I was trying to tackle. And as I said, I wanted to embody this solution in a robot.
The other thing that was interesting to me going back and looking at that work again after 30 years was that you actually had an analog implementation of essentially the intraoral time difference and how that neural mechanism works. I was looking at your thesis. You had pages of carefully hand-drawn diagrams of all the electronics. How did you design that? Did you do the electronics on that? And how did you get the timing right? It just begs a lot of questions that I never asked you when I wrote about this story the first time.
Yes, I didn't really design the electronics like at their circuit level. I had electronic technicians who I worked with very closely to try and get the right solution. But the key thing is the cricket's ears are connected to each other, and that produces this time delay by which sound reaches both the outside and the inside of the eardrum. And we knew that if we're trying to build a real system that was going to process sound, we couldn't do that computationally. We had to actually mimic it with analog electronics to get the speed that we needed to do the processing, because it's microseconds. So we basically talked a lot about it and discussed what we needed.
This might be a naive question, but do you know if you could do it now computationally?
I think it would still be difficult because precise timing is actually still a big problem for computational systems. Obviously, some of them are developed specifically for that, but you do need good hardware to deal with precise timing. Just synchronizing two sound streams is not a simple thing to do.
And so what you were able to show with the robot was that the female robot cricket, this is not any old robot cricket, the female robot cricket is listening out for chirps from its mate. And if the mate is sending out the right chirps, then the robot will naturally turn and move towards it. And each of these chirps is going to lure it more and more in the direction of the source. Do I have that right?
More or less. So the key thing for recognizing that it is a male cricket, so one is the frequency at which he's calling. And this is where this analog electronic system is critical, because it means that it doesn't specifically filter for the frequency, but the way that the localization mechanism works has a delay that's tuned to the frequency. And our hypothesis was that this is the case for the cricket as well, that she's tuned to this particular frequency by her body size, effectively. So that's one half of the problem. And the other half is the pattern of the chirp, which has particular repetition of syllables, which can be very distinctive for different species. And so that part we were modeling in the kind of neural system.
So you've done also what I would call some more conventional cognitive neuroscience, where you're looking at various elements to do with bee navigation. Can you talk through what you looked at, what you found?
So people have looked at the behavior of bees navigating for a very long time, and the fact that they can go kilometers away from their nest in a random pattern and then go directly back. And this is something that biologists call path integration. Robotics, people would call it odometry. Sailors would call it dead reckoning. And so people have known that bees could do this, that they could use sky cues as a compass and could use optic flow for the direction, but no one had any idea how it was done in the brain. There were lots of computational models, but no one had really any idea. And the big breakthrough really came from looking at a particular area of the brain, which is called the central complex, because it's in the center of the brain and it's complex. But it's a very structured neural architecture that people had known about for a long time and seemed to be getting all the right inputs. It gets the compass information, it gets the optic flow information. So we worked together with a biologist called Stanley Heinze, who'd been recording from this area. And I had a very good PhD student called Tom Stone. And we said, can we make sense of what this architecture is to understand why it might be actually doing the navigation problem? And essentially that's what we solved. It was a very fun project because, for example, understanding that it was this area of the brain in different insects looks more or less circular, but then when we traced out all the neural connections, we could see that it really was connected as a circle, which meant that it could underlie very well this kind of compass behavior. And in fact, what it actually does is to represent vectors. So it can represent a vector in terms of a sinusoidal activation pattern across an array of neurons. And this turns out to be very powerful because once you can represent a vector this way, you can add vectors, you can shift vectors, you can invert vectors. And once you can do things with vectors, then you can do any kind of spatial calculation that you want to do, including path integration, including adding up all the vectors along your path so that you then have a vector that points back home. So we showed essentially that this neural system should be able to do this, and then there's been various follow-up studies by people who work on Drosophila and so forth that have shown that a lot of the ideas we came up with actually seem to really hold in the system.
Right, because that central complex is common to most insects, is that right?
Yes, indeed. Actually, it's well preserved across all arthropods. And we think this is because it serves this very general function that is being then co-opted by different insects to do different things.
Very good. So another thing that you've done is you've deciphered how the bee waggle dance, which is famous now, I guess, as being the way that bees communicate with each other to tell them where food is and such. One thing that was mysterious was it's fine to look at the waggle dance head on, but how are you understanding what it means if you're at some diagonal to the thing and the sun is behind it? So there's this whole question of how it gets the full context and is still able to make sense of the communication, the other bees who are not doing the dance. So do you want to talk through how that evolved?
Yes, so it's been known for a long time that if we watch a bee on the honeycomb, we can see that it's doing this waggle dance at an angle that represents the direction relative to the sun of the food, and that the duration of the waggle dance is the distance to the food. So again, a vector. But the mystery has been how in the dark in the hive, another bee that's just hanging around this dancing bee could be getting this information because it can't watch it from above. And so what we discovered was that the angle of the antennae of the watching bee tell it what angle it is to the dancing bee. And it also knows its own direction to gravity. And then it needs to do a vector transformation to work out which way the bee is dancing, and therefore the information about where the food is. And we realized that our circuit that we had developed for vector transformation for the path integration problem was exactly the same circuit that we would need to do this calculation. So we actually took measurements directly from the antennae of a follower bee and put them into our model, and we could get out the prediction of the direction of the dancer bee from the model.
So that work is relatively recent, right? That's just in the last couple of years. One of the things that I find interesting is because you had this AI background, have you thought about how these kinds of lessons you've learned from the central complex of the bee and other insects and all this sophisticated navigation, do you think that those kinds of structures could have an impact in robotics? Do you think they could have a place?
This particular circuit is an interesting example here because it's been fascinating to work out what it does and how it does it. But it turns out it's something we know how to do already, as it were. So vector arithmetic, I mean, all modern computation is based on operating with vectors. So in that sense, we don't need to do that using this kind of neural circuit for it to be able to do it efficiently. So I think what we can learn more from the insects perhaps is some of the mechanisms they use for getting, for example, external compass information. So they're a very efficient way of using not just where the sun is in the sky, but the polarization pattern of the sky. And being able to do that even if they can only see a small patch of the polarization pattern, even the rest is covered by a tree canopy or clouds or whatever. So I think there's more things on that side that we probably could exploit for robotics. But the central computation, it's, as I say, it's really interesting, but maybe not amazingly novel.
I didn't think it was novel, but I wondered whether it was particularly efficient, especially if you're thinking about very tiny robots.
Certainly it can be done in very compact form. So the networks I'm talking about are on the order of 100 neurons, and we've shown that we can fly a robot using this network and have it find its way back to its start location. So I think in that sense, yes, there's definitely some things we can learn. And I think the principle could have been done, as I say, with other kinds of computation, but you have to have the right inputs for it to be effective and robust.
So that's interesting, actually. I don't think I realized that you had tested those systems with robots as well. So can you talk about those experiments?
So we did put the central complex network for path integration both on a wheeled robot, just doing a very simple sort of initial test, but also on a flying robot and a autonomous robot flying vehicle. And we had a downward facing camera that could do the optic flow. We still used a more conventional compass because that's system we've been working on since to do the sky polarization compass. But we did test it outdoors over fairly long distances, and yeah, it could do a good job.
Very good. So yet another insect you've looked at is the ant. Now, my understanding is you were attempting to show the function of the hairs on the inside of the ant's grippers, the mandibles, showing what they're for, essentially, what their function is. So this was another case where you decided to use a robot. Can you explain why you felt that was the best way to do it and what you found?
Sure. So this is a very new project. It's been going a couple of years, but still very new, where we're trying to understand how ants grasp objects. And it was partly motivated by this thought of there's lots of things insects can do, and robots can already do some of them, but some of them they don't do well at all. And one of them is grasp unknown objects in clutter, which ants can do effortlessly for all sorts of shapes and sizes. So we basically were trying to look more closely at what ants are doing. And the whole project includes trying to understand what sensory information they get about the object, so what they get from antennal contact, other sorts of contact, how they orient themselves. And we are doing 3D filming of ants to try and understand that. But one simple thing we noticed was that their main gripping apparatus is their mouth, which is their mandibles, which is just a simple two-fingered gripper, effectively. And in all ant mouths that you look at look quite hairy. And these are generally thought of as sensory hairs. So they do detect, if the hair gets bent, they can detect that something's in their mouth, essentially. But we thought maybe they also served a mechanical function, that they actually help support when you try and pick something up. So it was a very simple idea, and my postdoc Mohammed decided to take it and run with it and see what happened if you just took a simple robotic two-finger gripper and added some hairs. And it turned out it works very well to stabilize the grip, particularly of rounded objects, which normally a two-finger gripper has difficulty to keep and to manipulate.
How do you look at the design of an experiment like that in terms of scaling up from the sort of size and materials properties of the hairs on the mandible of an ant to something that is the size of a robot?
So in this case, we didn't concern ourselves too much with that. We just thought, does this principle apply? And it might have not worked. And then that would have maybe been a hint that maybe this scale is an issue. And I think there are certain things about how the ant picks up objects that certainly rely on the relative scale. But we don't think that's the whole story. We think they do a lot of things very successfully that we can extract and try and apply in robotics. So that's been our kind of approach, to try and look for which things in the ant would scale up, rather than trying to build tiny robots.
My understanding from reading your paper is that actually those hairs were thought to mainly have a sensory purpose. So would that be a bit like whiskers?
Whiskers are active hair sensors, whereas these hairs are passive, but otherwise they're similar to a whisker in that the only sensing is at the base of the sensor, so it's the bending of the sensor. And we had looked at this actually in other wind sensors that insects have. So we did many years ago escape behaviors of cockroaches that are driven by wind sensors that are very similar. So in a way, it's a very simple sensor because it's just detecting the bend. But here in the example that you're talking about, they weren't even sensory systems, so they were just completely passive 3D printed plastic hairs, essentially. And that was enough to improve the grip by quite a large amount.
In some of this work, in all of this work actually that we've talked about, you've used robots to sort of demonstrate that the underlying cognitive models that you've been working on are correct and that they work and that they produce the behavior that you want them to or that you expected them to. How do you go about choosing these projects? How do you decide which is a cognitive model that would lend itself to that kind of embodied approach to demonstrating the underlying model?
In some extent, I start the other way around, in that I've always been interested in problems where you have to go all the way from the sensory input to the motor output, and trying to explain the whole system. And obviously, because that's complicated, then you need to pick a system in which you think that's possible. So that was why the cricket phonotaxis at the beginning, you can boil it down to it's a sound input and it's a orientation output, for example. So I just feel like you don't understand a cognitive problem unless you understand what the input is and what the output is. And that's always been really the guiding thing. Then I just look for examples where I think that complete loop can be tackled, maybe at a more abstract level to start with, or simplifying in some ways over all the gory detail, but still always trying to close the loop is really being important.
So I know you've been working with Elisabetta Kika at the University of Groningen, a neuromorphic engineer who's already been on the podcast. Can you tell me what you two are working on together, and particularly, of course, about the neuromorphic elements of it?
So that's actually a European-funded project that is also with the University of Lund and with people in Copenhagen, where we're actually looking at optoelectronics using nanowires. So it's actually a fundamentally different substrate to the kind of standard neuromorphic approach, the kind of silicon approach. And our contribution to that is trying to understand how to use this central complex circuit as a target mechanism to try and implement using this nanowire approach, which has proved very difficult, but it's all very experimental, even at the nanowire level. How they do the communication between the nanowires, what's possible there, is still all under development. So then we're trying to find ways to explore the circuits. But Elisabetta's group has also been working on using neuromorphic hardware to implement and explore some of the models that I've discussed so far. For example, the central complex model. I know she's done implementations of that, and also on the mushroom body, which is another circuit in the insect brain for learning and memory that we've done some work on and that she's looked at neuromorphic implementations for.
Very good. The way you work, this way of using robots to demonstrate these biological principles or these biological models, is really unusual. Can you tell me what you think it adds to the biological side? You know, why it's a contribution to biology?
Yes, it's certainly the case that I come at biological problems from a different perspective to standard biology or neuroscience or even cognitive science. And I found it incredibly useful to think about these problems from the beginning as a robot problem, in the sense of, if I was to build a robot to do this, what would I need to know? How would I go about it? And it links back to what I said about understanding the whole problem. So you can't just stop at the sensory input and what the brain reaction is, and you can't just think of motor patterns as patterns coming from being an output of the brain. You have to think of this continuous loop. And that's been very productive in the work that I've done, and often led me to a new insight into a problem that's turned out to be very valuable.
That leads me to a question about how you decide which bits it matters to model faithfully and which bits you don't. So take the cricket. So you've got this little wheeled robot, which moves nothing like a cricket, but it does at least move. How do you decide whether the jumping of a cricket is an important part of the mechanism, and how do you decide whether it's not?
So sometimes that's guided by what the behavioral descriptions are, if you like. So nearly all the cricket research, what they plot as their output is the steering of the animal, not the legged movement of the animal. So at least initially we didn't worry about that. If we could understand the steering part, that was enough. But we have actually done some work since on leg movements, because the ears are actually on their legs. So what they're getting about directional information actually depends a little bit on their stepping patterns. As I said, the starting point is a complete loop. And so then you just have to be pragmatic about what's plausible to build the first time round and get what insights you can, and then to realize where you're not matching, you haven't captured everything. So then you start to add more detail. But that's very much the approach I take.
And have there been any experiments where you've just had to walk away and just say, you know what, that would be a really nice experiment if we could do it, but it's too complex in terms of the mechanics of it or in terms of the electronics of it or something?
Yeah, so one example would be, we actually looked at how maggots crawl. Very nice work by my PhD student, Jane Lovelace. And they came up with a really nice model that was very minimal neural implementation and exploited the physics of the body. And it at least in simulation, produced really interesting crawling behavior that looked like spontaneous exploration but was completely deterministic. And it would be really nice to build that as a physical system and see it working. But currently, the kinds of motor systems we have, I mean, we can look at soft robotics and so forth, but we just don't have anything that would really replicate what we need to be able to build it and show that this nice principle actually takes effect.
So we're here at the University of Edinburgh, where you're a professor of biorobotics. I think of what you do, based on just my own reading, as mostly trying to understand the biology. But I'm, of course, very interested in the machines rather than the brain side. So do you think of what you do as making a contribution to robotics more generally? And what kind of contribution is that?
So I certainly think there can be a contribution to robotics, and it's partly just from watching the insects and what they're capable of. And it's very clear they can do things that we would like robots to do and that we can't make robots do at the moment. And they do it with very constrained processing and very low power demands. So it seems obvious that we must be able to learn something. So it's not that every robot task is going to be solved by copying insects, but I think there's a lot we can learn.
Barbara Webb, thanks for coming on to Brains and Machines.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Sunny. Barbara Webb is one of my idols. If I were to become someone when I grow up, I'd love to be her. She has a truly in-depth systems-level approach to understanding cognition through robotics. And for more about Barbara Webb's work, please go to brainsandmachines.net. Now, we welcome back our regular commentator, Professor Ralph Etienne-Cummings from Johns Hopkins University.
Hey guys, how are you doing? Happy to be back again.
So I'm truly excited for this episode, and I would start with something she said, and I want to quote her: "Unless you build a robot system, you hadn't really built an intelligent system." What do you think about this? Because from my side, I agree.
I think that you'll get a lot of pushback on that one now. Simply because of what's been going on with large language models and those kinds of things, right? So clearly, folks believe that there is some intelligence there, maybe not fully intelligent, but at least, as intelligent as some of the robot systems that are being built. But yeah, it's clearly the way to understand and to see the interactions of intelligence with the real world. That is what robotics provides us.
I totally agree. If I don't see interaction with the word, I don't see intelligence there, or I see, it's completely disembodied. It's not my approach.
It's interesting to me, you said that in the panel discussion yesterday, actually, something similar. And to me, it's an important part of the whole philosophy of neuromorphic engineering, that idea of being embodied and self-contained, about being able to interact with the world in real time, with real dynamics. Bear in mind that when I started my career, robotics was one of the things I really spent my time following. So I guess I got the Kool-Aid very early.
But did you drink it?
Yes, I got and drank the Kool-Aid very early. And so I'm definitely in that embodiment mindset.
So I would like to start with her work on cricket. She was saying that she chose analog electronics for cricket sound localizations because computational timing wasn't precise enough. And then again, when is physical embodiment essential? And when is optional? And how do we decide each biological details, if they're essential or not?
So I'd like to just say something on that, just related to Barbara's actual cricket project. It's really interesting seeing your own reaction to a project that you looked at for the first time 30 years ago. And, obviously I know a lot more now and am asking better questions now, I would hope. And one of the things that interested me is she did not design this electronically, right? She knew what the characteristics needed to be. She knew that she needed that interoral time difference, and the only way to do it at the time was in analog. And I think that gets us back to another issue that comes up time and time again. When do you have to do things physically? you have to do things physically when you can't do them any other way. For one thing. Sometimes it can be more efficient. If you think about the technology in the 90s when she started working on that project, when she was doing her PhD, it literally would not have been possible to do that using any kind of digital signal processing. I don't know whether it is now. I did ask her that, and she wasn't sure that it was, but then she's a roboticist. She's not an electrical engineer. So I would just say, though, that the underlying principle there is you do it that way. You use the custom chip, you use this specialized hardware when there's no other way to do it. And that's a principled way to go forward.
Right. So I would argue that maybe it's not that it was not possible, it was just that it was difficult, right? Remember that in the 90s, around the time when she was doing the cricket work, that was the advent of the DSP, the digital signal processing chips, that was just coming into its own and becoming a tool in the arsenal of signal processing and so on. But you still have to do the digitization, right? You have to convert the signal from analog to digital before you do that. That conversion was always hard, was always difficult to do if you are trying to get almost sub-microsecond resolution. So that is where I think the analog direct comparisons becomes really relevant. Also, think about the sizes that she's talking about, right? So the two ears are on the feet of the cricket. So you're talking about a handful of millimeters separation between these two microphones that then has to somehow process the time difference between the travel of sound between millimeters. Yeah, you're talking about microseconds again, right? So it becomes hard. And if you have a lot of processing that sits behind that, then the timing becomes even more important. So yeah, I can see why analog would have been the appropriate steps to take at that time. These days, when we're talking about clocking processors at multi-gigahertz, maybe it's not as big of a time issue.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to say about this is something that we all absolutely know, but sometimes forget, which is that what you can do as a PhD student or what you can do in a particular university lab, it's the state of the art, hopefully, in what you're actually doing, but it's not necessarily the case that you can take state of the art tools from what other people are doing. So it's about what you can find, who you can collaborate with, what you can do at the time. And that sometimes can be frustrating because, we look at a project, for instance, like Gordon Cheng's, and we think, ooh, wouldn't it have been great if he could have made some really cool event-based chips that were doing all of the tactile sensing in a single thing. But he was trying to do something else. He was trying to do something cheap. He was trying to do something scalable that would work with the technology he had at the time. He didn't want to be spending all of his money making chips. So I think that's important to remember. It's in the nature of research.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you totally. But going back to kind of the fundamentals of what Barbara was doing, the comparison between signals at that scale of the cricket body, there were other people that were thinking about it at that time as well, maybe a little bit later, which is Gert Kaunberg's, for example, right? Is a classic example of doing kind of the same problem, which is looking for bearing to a sound source far away. One of the benefits maybe that the cricket has is that it's doing things at high frequency, if you know what I mean. The sound itself, is that chirp, is a kilohertz or higher, right? So that's makes it a little bit more packetized sound. Whereas folks like Gert Kaunberg's were looking at low frequency sounds, where you're looking at not only the time difference between those two microphones, but also the level difference, which is tiny. Again, right at the level of the noise floor. So how can you pull signals out of the noise in order to be able to understand where that signal is coming from? That's another thing that I believe is really difficult. And that combination of the two works. What Barbara did and what Gert, with his sound localization, that is really strong as a mechanism for localizing sound in space.
Another thing that she said is from the sensor input to the motor output and trying to explain the whole system. I find really interesting and beautiful. And I was thinking about other scientists on this direction. And it came to my mind, Tony Prescott was working on whisker-based texture discrimination on a mobile robot. And I was thinking if we have any other examples, for example, also Jenny Reed's works on praying mantis, do we have any other examples examples of scientists really building up compact robots, following up crickets or any other insect.
The insects that I always like to talk about, just going back to olden days, were Mark Tilden's robots, which were not very well understood. I don't know if they're well understood now. I don't know if people have gone back and reverse engineered those, because there weren't a lot of papers on that work. There were a lot of kits, but these were very beautiful robots that would move and behave, and you could rip their legs off. And this is, again, back in the early 90s, entirely analog, made with very simple electronics. But they weren't defined using neuroscientific principles. They were just made using analog electronic principles to make these things behave and move and sense.
Because in my case, for example, what I'm looking at is the human retina, right? But I'm also trying to look at different other insects, because it's true that they're way more studied, and then you have way better data to understand and compare. Because what she has worked on is a very compact processing system that works and gets back where it was going from, right? You get the bee that it leaves the nest and it gets back into the same place. And what I'm thinking is, of course, like imagine a drone that would require nothing to just go and come back. We should possibly maybe explore a little bit more insects from the neuromorphic point of view.
So some of the work with ants, trying to understand the odometry that ants do in terms of navigation in deserts, I mean, those go back a lot of ways. The bee waggle dance story, we've had that a couple of times at the neuromorphic Telluride workshop, right? Looking at it more from a computational perspective as well as an application perspective in building robots that do that. At Telluride, we've had entire rigs of neurophysiology with Chuck Higgins catching dragonflies and bringing it into the lab and putting electrodes in their central complex and trying to understand how their vision system works in other part of the visual system that he was looking at, motion estimation in particular. So yeah, this is very much a driver of a lot of what we do in neuromorphic engineering, and this continues.
And speaking of insects and wheeled robots, there were also the Reed Harrison robots that I always loved, the fly's eye robots, which used the Ricard filters to determine which way to go to avoid obstacles.
Yeah, and one other one that was really cool that we had at Telluride as well at one point was Noah Cowan had the cockroach robot with the antennas. And you could basically figure out objects as it ran along the walls, right? Because he was trying to mimic the function of a roach as it runs in the dark and so on, and how similar to what Barbara refers to as being sensors at the base of the antenna tells you something about what the antenna is engaged with, if you know the mechanical properties of the antenna itself. So that kind of object recognition from looking at only sensors at the very base of the antennas were also being pursued, being looked at from a neuromorphic perspective. One of the cool things that Noah does, Noah Cowan, is weakly electric fish, right? How that whole prey capturing or predator detection and predator avoiding process and the neural processes that goes from sensors to processing to actuation, to either catch the prey or get away from it, right? That is also something that has been modeled in a neuromorphic perspective. That's one of the things that Barbara talks about, right? Is that entire closed loop, and robotics provide a nice, neat way to test those ideas out. There I would depart a little bit and say, they're being tested both in artificial environments as well as in real world environments. In artificial, I mean by simulation computers and so on as well.
Yeah, I'd like to also highlight the difficulty of doing these kinds of experiments, because from a biological standpoint, my understanding is you're not just proving that it works, because presumably you can quite easily see that a particular mechanism works. It's about showing that the behavior that you get is the behavior that you would expect from the animal. And to do that requires a lot of things to come together, particularly including time constants, which I think is always a difficult issue. I mean, think about this cricket. One of the things I remember from reading this back in the day was essentially the cricket listens, it jumps, and then it listens again and it jumps again. If you had got your time constants wrong, you could end up with the thing just moving continuously, right? Which would not produce the same. So it's a very different paradigm in terms of experimentation than actually trying to build robots that work as robots. You're trying to build robots that work as something else. And so it's kind of fascinating from that point of view. And to turn that on its head, and this is my fault because obviously I was asking the questions, one of the things I didn't feel I got down to the base of was what these things were teaching us about how to make good robots. Right? These are made from a biological perspective about testing out and proving biological hypotheses. And, you know, biology is all very nice, but I'm interested in robots, so I want to know what's the payoff for the robots. And I'm not sure I got down to asking that clearly enough in the interview.
I think it's a mix, right? I mean, you got to do both. You got to improve the robots as well as you got to understand the biology a little bit more, right? And seeing whether the principles apply. Like she said, many things that she's done has been tried in the robotics environment to see whether or not the function, the idea works, right? That's, again, this functional neuromorphic approach that I've been a big fan of, as opposed to necessarily trying to mimic the biology per se, right? She is learning from ideas that she sees in biology in order to try to give alternative approaches to robotics control. That's the way I see her work as being really valuable. And we see that in other domains, right? We see it in understanding SLAM, which is a very robotics thing. But people are looking at how the hippocampus works and whether those ideas can be used in a very classically robotics thing. Or you go back to your friend, Williams, I think he was, who did the slinky moving robot.
Matt Williamson.
There you go. Right? Where again, it was the same kind of idea, right? It was like, hey, humans do this really well. How do you make a robot actually perform this kind of function where it's a combination of softness and hardness and control and the drum beats as well that he did, the robot playing drums and the reactiveness to the whole entire thing. So I see it as biology giving ideas on alternative ways for classical roboticists to use in their system. And last thing, you think about some of the CPG work that we did with Tony Lewis, exactly that same ideas.
Matt Williamson, just to put it into context so that people know who he is. So he worked with Rod Brooks at MIT back in the day on COG, and he was the one who built the compliant limbs. The other thing was, you made me think of Auke Eisbert, who also does very nice CPGs. They're not insects, but they're salamanders. And I think his work is really lovely and should get a mention.
You just made me think about the recent work that I've done, and I'm trying to microsaccade, right? If I microsaccade wrong, so if my microsaccads are slightly bigger, the system doesn't work anymore. So, but I truly appreciate that my model is still working everywhere, indoor, outdoor. I don't need training, I don't need data. And that's the power of these closed loop systems, right? And we should enforce it a little bit more. And she was also talking about the ant mandible, right? That it's a gripper. It's just a gripper, right? So these things can scale up. And I think we should put a little bit more trust in nature. Even though we are in the era of LLMs, we should still trust a little bit more nature and continue on this path, because we will find more and more. No one has understood how a single mechanisms work in our cortex. We understand very tiny details, and then we try to put things together, but we are definitely not there.
I think what Barbara talked about particularly is this notion of active sensing. You put the action in the loop of sensing in order to improve the information that you gather, in order to make the information that you gather more relevant to the task at hand. And that brings me the story all the way back to Ruzhina Baichi, her first paper on active vision, that essentially spearheaded, if you will, an entire research area. I'm talking now back in the late 80s and 90s. Folks started looking at sensing, acting, and perception models that takes advantage of all these elements. And that's probably the most striking aspect of what I see what Barbara has done, and to do it in a way that is so elegantly inspired by biology, and then seeing that have its effect, positive effect in real life, and doing it in a closed loop manner. So that would be the thing, the one piece that I would say is the most salient aspect of a lot of the work that she has done.
Thank you, Sunny, for yet another great interview, and Ralph for your great comments as usual. In the next episode, Sunny will be talking to Brett Aimoni from Sandia National Labs in the US. We hope you will join us then.